They did not come screaming from the north. That was the first warning. No burning villages marked their road. No skulls swung from their saddles. No drunken horde came howling for plunder beneath the winter sky. The silver host marched in silence. Their armor shone like moonlight on a knife. Their banners were silk. Their horses made no sound. And at their head rode a beautiful monster who understood something the Empire had forgotten. Walls can be climbed, gates can be broken, but a man's secret hunger that can be invited in. By the time the first town realized it had not been spared, its nobles were gone, its priests were whispering new prayers, and its finest swordsmen had ridden south beneath silver banners. This is not the story of an invasion. It is the story of an empire applauding its own damnation. Chapter 1. The procession of velvet and steel snow had followed the warband down from the north like a loyal hound. It clung to the iron rims of the wagons, crusted the boots of the marching men, and powdered the black plumes of the cavalry that rode in perfect files beneath banners of silver silk. The wind should have torn those banners ragged. It did not. They streamed smooth and bright against the grey morning, each one embroidered with a different device. A weeping mask, a serpent coiled around a chalice, a hand holding a thorned rose, a sword thrust through a harp. No drums announced them. No howling mob came before them. No herd of braying beastmen trampled the road into filth. The silver host marched in silence. That was what frightened Marcus Holt most. He was a charcoal burner by trade, a widower by misfortune, and a coward by the plain admission of his own heart. From the tree line above the old midden road, he watched them pass through the valley below, and found himself wishing they would scream. Screaming he understood. Screaming meant raiders. Screaming meant fire, axes, skulls nailed over gates, and the other honest horrors of the north. This was worse. The men in the vanguard wore lacquered breastplates polished bright enough to hold the color of the sky. Their cloaks were white, violet, and pale blue, though stained at the hems with old brown gore. They marched shoulder to shoulder, halberds tilted at exactly the same angle. Behind them came swordsmen with curved blades, their faces hidden behind silver masks, shaped like beautiful women, snarling lions, laughing children. A company of crossbowmen followed, each bolt tipped with black metal. Then came the wagons. Marcus crossed himself and muttered a prayer to Sigmar when he saw what pulled them. Not horses. Not exactly. They had the long bodies and restless heads of horses, but their eyes were too wide, their lips peeled too far back from wet square teeth, and their manes were plaited with strips of human skin, so carefully tanned they looked like cream ribbon. Bells hung from their harnesses. The bells made no sound. At the center of the column rode a man on a white destrier with a gilded skull for a faceplate. The rider wore armor of silver plate, chased with flowering vines. A cloak of black velvet fell from his shoulders, untouched by mud or snow. His helm was tucked beneath one arm, revealing hair as pale as moonlit bone, tied back with a scarlet cord. His face was narrow, calm, and almost painfully beautiful. Marcus hated him at once. The rider turned his head. Across the distance, through the mist and pine branches, his eyes found Marcus. The charcoal burner froze. His bowels loosened. The rider smiled faintly and raised one gloved finger to his lips. A secret shared. Marcus ran. By noon, The bells of Hohenbrook were ringing. The town sat crouched beside the river Drossel, a walled knot of timber houses, smoke-blackened roofs, pig yards, breweries, and a squat temple of Sigmar built from yellow stone. It was not a great city. No elector had ever feasted there. No famous general had ever died in its streets. But it had strong gates, a toll bridge, 3 wealthy wool families, and a militia proud enough to drill twice a month when the weather was kind. Its captain, a red-faced veteran named Ehrlich Dorn, gathered 37 spearmen at the north gate and told them not to piss themselves. Most failed. By the time the silver host appeared along the road, half the town had crowded onto the parapets. Mothers held children too tightly. Apprentices whispered. The old priest, Father Gunther, stood above the gate in his patched black robes, hammer pendant clutched in one fist. Captain Dorn had expected a charge. He had expected arrows, ladders, curses in the dark tongue. Instead, a single rider came forward. He was not the pale Lord Marcus had described, but a lean man in red leather armor, with curling black hair and a dueling scar running from lip to chin. He carried no shield. At his hip hung a rapier with a jeweled guard. In one hand he held a white rose. He stopped just beyond bowshot and bowed from the saddle. "Good people of Hohenbrook," he called. His Reichsspiel was excellent, with only the faintest northern music under the words. "My master, Seraphine Veyl, called by some the Mirror Prince, sends greetings. He asks leave to water his horses, purchase grain, and share wine beneath your walls." Captain Dorn spat over the battlement. "You can share worms beneath them." The rider smiled. "My master expected suspicion. He admires it. In this age, trust is a quick road to an early grave. Come closer, and I'll show you." A ripple of laughter went through the militia. "Too loud, too strained." The rider looked up toward the crowd and lifted the rose. "We did not come to sack your town. Had we wished it, your gate would already be burning, and your sons would be choking on smoke. We have coin, we have physicians, we have musicians, we have wine from lands. Your merchants only lie about visiting. Tonight, my master invites your notables to dine in his pavilion. Your captain, your burgomeister, your priests, your artists, your finest swords, your hungriest souls." Father Gunther leaned over the wall. "You come under the shadow of ruin. There is no table between honest folk and the servants of the dark gods." The rider's smile sharpened. "Then come to denounce us, Father. Bring your hammer, bring your certainty. My master treasures rare things."
Captain Dorn ordered the archers to notch. The rider did not move.
For one long breath, the entire town waited. Snow drifted between wall and road. A baby cried somewhere behind the parapet. Then the pale lord rode forward. Seraphine Veyl passed his herald without looking at him. He came within bowshot, then within pistol range, then close enough that Dorn could see the pale lashes around his eyes. The militia tensed. Bowstrings creaked. Seraphine removed one glove, slowly, finger by finger. "Captain Dorn," he said, voice gentle, "you are a man of discipline. I salute it." Dorn swallowed. "Take one more step, and discipline will put a quarrel in your throat. Of course." Seraphine looked at the weapons aimed at him with mild interest. "But before that, May I return something? He gestured. Two masked soldiers dragged a man forward and threw him into the snow. It was Lucas Brenner, one of Hohenbrook's road wardens. He had ridden north 3 days earlier and had not returned. Now he lay gasping, hands bound, face swollen purple. One eye had burst in its socket. His lower lip hung split and trembling. A woman on the wall screamed his name. He was found robbing refugees, Seraphine said. His victims were poor, frightened, and freezing. He had taken their food and boots. His gaze rose to the battlements. A petty cruelty. I dislike petty things. Lucas tried to speak. Blood bubbled between his teeth. Seraphine drew a slender dagger from his belt. The blade was bright as frost. Shall I leave justice to you? Father Gunter began. Do not listen to Dawn, cut him off. Lucas Brenner, is it true? The road warden sobbed. That was answer enough. Dawn's jaw worked. The men around him shifted uneasily. Everyone knew Lucas was a bastard. Everyone knew his badge had hidden more crimes than it punished. Seraphine knelt in the snow beside the bound man and touched the dagger to Lucas's cheek. Justice must be seen, he said. Otherwise it is only a rumor told by the powerful. Then he opened Lucas from groin to breastbone. The sound was wet and intimate, like a butcher splitting a pig. Lucas arched so hard his spine cracked. Steam rose from him in a pink mist as his guts spilled into the snow, loops of blue-gray intestine sliding over Seraphine's silver boots. The smell hit the wall a moment later. Blood, shit, hot meat. One militiaman vomited down the inside of his breastplate. Seraphine did not flinch. He reached into the man's opened belly, took something dark and pulsing in his bare hand, and squeezed until it burst between his fingers. Lucas died looking at the gate he had sworn to defend. Seraphine stood, blood dripping from his hand. A thief returned, a debt paid. Now, Captain, shall we speak as civilized men? By sunset, the pavilion stood outside Hohenbrook. No one admitted giving permission. Later, every man of importance would say he had opposed it. Yet the gates opened. Grain was sold. Horses were watered. Physicians in perfumed masks treated frostbite among the poor and set old bones with astonishing skill. A fiddler from the host played in the market square, and apprentices found themselves clapping before remembering to be afraid. The pavilion itself was a monstrous thing, raised on the frozen common like a prince's traveling palace. Its poles were black, lacquered wood. Its robes were braided silk. Lanterns burned with rose-colored flame. Inside, the ground was covered with rugs so fine that the burgomeister's wife removed her shoes without realizing it. Hohenbrook's elite arrived in their best clothes and worst thoughts. Burgomeister Klaus Mertz came wearing fox fur and a chain of office heavy enough to pull his shoulders down. With him came his 2 sons, both useless and handsome. The wool merchants came. The master of the sword school came, thin as a stiletto and twice as vain. 3 minor nobles from nearby estates came, pretending they had only come to observe. Father Gunter came with 6 temple men and a face like carved oak. Captain Dawn came in armor. He wished he had brought more men. Inside, the air was warm and sweet. Servants moved like ghosts, pouring wine dark as heart blood. Musicians played somewhere unseen, not loudly, but the melody threaded itself through conversation and under the skin. It made men speak more freely. It made women smile at old enemies. It made grudges feel noble and desires feel like truths long denied. Seraphine sat at the head of the table beneath a canopy of silver gauze. He had changed from armor into a coat of white brocade clasped at the throat with a ruby. No crown rested on his head. He needed none. "To Hohenbrook," he said, raising his glass. "A town of walls, laws, and hidden appetites." No one drank. Seraphine drank alone and laughed softly. The feast began. There were roasted swans glazed with honey, black bread, pears in spiced wine, eels curled like sleeping serpents, venison so tender it fell apart under the knife. Men who had come to condemn ate until grease shone on their lips. Father Gunther refused everything until Seraphine asked whether hunger made a man holier, and then the priest drank water with shaking hands. The talk turned first to trade, then to war, then to art. Seraphine listened more than he spoke. That was his gift. He could make a merchant feel like a philosopher and a soldier feel like a king. He praised Burgermeister Mertz for his prudence, then asked whether prudence had ever set his blood alight. He admired the master swordsman's hands, then wondered aloud why such hands served provincial boys who would never understand beauty. He asked Father Gunther if faith was meant to free men from fear, or merely teach them to worship it. Each question was a blade slid gently between ribs. Captain Dorn saw it happening. He saw eyes brighten, saw backs straighten, saw old disappointments come crawling out of polite faces. He pushed his chair back. "We're leaving." The music did not stop, but something in the air tightened. Burgermeister Mertz blinked. "Captain, sit down. I said we're leaving." Seraphine looked at him with something like regret. Must the honest man always be the dullest one in the room? Dorn's hand went to his sword. Better dull than damned. A chair scraped. The master of the sword school, Dieter Kroll, rose smiling. He had drunk too much wine. Or not enough. His eyes shone fever-bright. "Captain, you insult our host?" Dorn stared at him. "Sit down, Kroll. You have always mistaken bluntness for virtue. You've always mistaken dancing for fighting." That struck home. Kroll's smile died. Seraphine leaned back, pleased. A disagreement among professionals. How rare, how nourishing. Dorn drew his sword. Kroll drew his. The first clash rang through the pavilion like a struck bell. Dorn fought like a soldier. Short cuts, hard steps, no wasted motion. Kroll fought like a poem written with murder for ink. His rapier flickered, kissed Dorn's cheek, opened a red line from ear to jaw. Dorn snarled and smashed forward, using his heavier blade to batter the thrust aside. He caught Kroll with his shoulder and drove him into the table. Goblets toppled. Wine splashed like fresh blood. Kroll laughed and kicked Dorn in the knee. The captain staggered. Kroll lunged, point flashing for the eye. Dorn jerked aside, too slow. Steel carved through his brow. Blood poured down into his left eye, hot and blinding. He roared and swung blind. The blade struck meat. Kroll's left hand flew from his wrist. It landed in a bowl of pears. For an instant, everyone stared at it, pale fingers twitching among the fruit. Then Kroll screamed. Dorn did not stop. He hammered the pommel of his sword into Kroll's mouth. Teeth cracked. Kroll dropped to one knee, choking. Dorn grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and put the edge of his sword against the man's throat. "Yield." Kroll spat teeth and blood onto the rug. His eyes rolled toward Seraphine. The mirror prince smiled. Kroll drove the stump of his wrist into Dawn's wounded eye. The captain bellowed. Kroll surged up, mouth ruined, face slick with blood, and bit into Dawn's cheek. His teeth sank deep. Flesh tore. Dawn punched him once, twice, 3 times, each blow making Kroll's face less human. Cartilage flattened. One eye collapsed. Still Kroll clung to him, laughing through blood foam. Dawn finally got both hands around the swordsman's head and twisted. The crack was loud. Kroll dropped bonelessly to the rug. Dawn stood over him, heaving, half his face masked in blood, a strip of cheek hanging loose against his beard. No one moved. Then Seraphine began to applaud. One clap, then another. The sound spread. A noble woman joined. Then Merdz's eldest son. Then a merchant. Soon the pavilion thundered with applause, while Kroll's corpse leaked across the carpet, and Captain Dawn swayed like a butchered ox. "Magnificent," Seraphine whispered. "Ugly, stubborn, sincere violence. Do you see, friends? Even here, even in this muddy town, greatness strains against its cage." Father Gunther rose, trembling with fury. "This is evil." Seraphine turned to him. "No, Father. This is revelation." The priest lifted his hammer pendant. "You dress corruption in silk, but the stink remains. Then why are you still here?" That silenced him. Seraphine stood. His shadow stretched long and strange behind him, though the lanterns gave no cause for it. "I offer no chains. No man or woman enters my host unwilling. I promise only this. You will become what you secretly are. The artist will create without begging permission from dullards. The swordsman will test his blade against worthy flesh. The priest will preach without lying. The noble will rule without pretending service. The hungry will eat. The beautiful will be worshipped. The strong will be obeyed." Outside, the silent bells of the inhuman horses began to ring. Inside, several guests wept. By dawn, the silver host was gone. It left no burned homes, no broken gate, no mound of corpses, only the butchered remains of Lucas Brenner on the North Road, Dieter Kroll's body cooling beneath a wine-stained rug, and Captain Dawn nailed alive to the inside of the town gate with his own sword through both palms. He lasted until sunrise. When the first light touched the roofs, Hohenbruck discovered its absences. Burgomeister Mertz's sons were gone. So were 2 wool heirs, 7 apprentices, the choirmaster, the youngest temple scribe, 3 noble women, 9 militia veterans, Father Gunther's best-voiced acolyte, and the widow Elise Rauch, who painted saints in the chapel and had left behind every brush but one. Father Gunther found a silver mask on the altar. Inside it, written in a graceful hand, were the words, "We go south to gather the worthy." At mid-morning, Road Warden Ilse Krieger rode through the north gate and saw Captain Dawn hanging there, dead at last, his boots swaying gently above the blood-black mud. She looked past him to the road, where hundreds of precise footprints led away through the thawing snow, not away from the Empire, deeper into it. Chapter 2. The city that applauded Graustad had walls of old stone, guns on its towers, and men enough to think itself safe. It squatted on the south bank of the river Bergen like a miser over a strongbox, all slate roofs, crooked lanes, black chimneys, and tall guild halls stained by centuries of smoke. Barges came down river with wool, iron, salt, fish, and wine. Coaches rattled through its western gate toward Altdorf and Nulm. Priests called it a good imperial city. Merchants called it profitable. Soldiers called it defensible. The poor called it cold. The silver host arrived on the third evening after Hohenbruck. They did not come in a rush. They did not burn farmsteads or drive shrieking refugees before them. They appeared across the frozen fields north of the river in a long, bright line, their banners catching the last red of the sun. Silver armor shone through the mist. Pale horses stepped through the frost. Wagons rolled behind them with unnerving grace, their wheels wrapped in leather to muffle the sound. On Graustadt's walls, men stared until their breath smoked white through open mouths. Commandant Otto Riker stood on the north bastion with his spyglass pressed to one narrowed eye. He was a thick man with a shaven scalp, a pistol brace across his chest, and a beard cut square as a shovel. 26 years in Imperial service had carved most of the softness out of him. He had seen beastmen gnawing on their own dead. He had seen mutant children drowned in barrels by weeping mothers. He had seen men open their bellies rather than be taken alive by the things that came down from the north. He had never seen chaos march in formation like a prince's army on parade. "Count them," he said. Beside him, Sergeant Marta Klug licked a thumb and flipped through her tally slate. 300 foot, maybe more behind the wagons. 50 horse, artillery, none that I can see. Too neat for raiders. Raiders can learn neatness, not that neat. Riker lowered the glass. Beyond the killing ground, a pavilion was being raised on a low hill just outside the range of the city's great guns. The thing went up like a conjurer's trick. Poles lifted, silk unfurled. Lanterns bloomed pink and gold in the dusk. Servants moved in smooth lines. Musicians took their places. A road of carpet was rolled across the frost. A masquerade pavilion. Riker felt an old scar tighten under his collar. "Load the culverins," he said. A young officer hesitated. "My Lord Burgermeister ordered no provocation." Riker turned slowly. The officer went pale. "Loading the culverins, Commandant." Before full dark, the invitation arrived. It came tied to a white arrow fired over the north wall. The arrow struck the wooden door of the watchhouse with a clean thunk, quivering there beneath the painted comet of Sigmar. The paper was thick, scented, and sealed with silver wax marked by a smiling mask. Riker read it by lantern. "To the worthy citizens of Graustad, jewel of the Bogan Road, Seraphine Veyl, Lord of the Silver Host, humbly invites the city's nobles, captains, priests, artists, masters of craft, and all persons of refined appetite to attend a masquerade beneath his banners. No weapons shall be forbidden, no question refused, no courage overlooked. Come masked, come proud, come hungry." Sergeant Klug spat on the stones. "Hungry for a rope." Riker crumpled the invitation. "No one leaves the city. By midnight, half the city wanted to. That was the first defeat. Not a gate broken, not a man slain. A thought planted. In the high houses of Graustad, candles burned late. Nobles leaned over balconies and watched the rose-lit pavilion gleam beyond the walls. Young duelists paced bedrooms with their rapiers half drawn, muttering about honor and courage. Painters who had not sold a canvas in months stared at the invitation copies spreading hand to hand. Priests spoke sternly from temple steps, but their eyes drifted north to the music floating over the fields. The music was faint, almost too faint to hear. That made it worse. It slipped between shutters. It threaded through alleys. It trembled in cups of wine and in the teeth of men who hated themselves for humming along. At dawn, Riker arrested 6 apprentices, trying to lower themselves from the west wall with knotted sheets. At noon, he arrested a minor nobleman at the north gate with a jeweled mask hidden under his cloak. By evening, the city council summoned him. The council chamber stank of beeswax, damp wool, and fear disguised as importance. Burgomaster Albrecht Pfaff sat at the head table, swollen with wealth and gout, his fingers heavy with rings. Around him gathered merchants, magistrates, guildmasters, 2 priests of Sigmar, 1 priestess of Shalia, and Countess Elsbeth von Dracht, whose family owned half the vineyards east of the river, and all the arrogance within a day's ride. Riker stood before them with his helmet under one arm. "No one goes," he said. Pfaff rubbed his jowls. "Commandant, we are not children." "No, children are easier to keep alive." A merchant in blue velvet scowled. "If we refuse to parley, we may provoke attack. Their chaos filth breathing provokes them." Countess Elsbeth smiled behind her black lace veil. "And yet they have not attacked, because they're fishing." "For what?" Riker looked around the room, at the rings, at the scented gloves, at the soft throats above embroidered collars, for bait stupid enough to wriggle. Outrage flared at once. Voices rose. Rings struck tables. A priest demanded restraint. Pfaff demanded respect. Countess Elsbeth only laughed, quiet and delighted. In the end, they voted. Riker lost. That was the second defeat. At sunset, Graustadt opened its north gate. Not fully, just enough to let out 3 coaches, 20 mounted guards, 6 council representatives, a dozen nobles, 7 artists, 4 priests, 3 guild champions, and enough servants to make the whole thing seem respectable. Riker watched them pass, with his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Countess Elsbeth rode at the front in a gown of midnight blue beneath a fur mantle, her face hidden behind a silver swan mask. She paused beside him. "Do not look so wounded, Commandant. We go to gather knowledge. You go to be admired. Is there a difference? In coat, is there a difference? Is there a difference? Is there a difference? Is there a difference? Yes, knowledge survives flattery." Her smile showed small white teeth. "Then pray for me. I'll pray for the men who have to burn you later." The coach rolled on. Sergeant Klug leaned close. "Orders?" Riker watched the procession cross the frost toward the glowing pavilion. 20 picked men. Plain cloaks, no banners. We follow at a distance. If the bastards try anything, we cut our people out. And if our people don't want cutting..." Riker did not answer. The masquerade had already begun by the time the Imperial party arrived. It was obscene in its beauty. Silk walls rippled like water. Lanterns hung from poles carved into twisting vines and pale hands. Tables groaned beneath fruit, meat, sugared almonds, black bread, and wine in crystal bowls. Musicians played from behind gauze screens. The melody was quick, bright, and feverish, like laughter heard through a locked door. Every warrior of the Silver Host wore a mask. Some were handsome, some were monstrous, some were both. A woman in mirror-bright mail wore the face of a weeping saint. A giant in lacquered plate wore a child's porcelain smile. A hunchbacked standard-bearer wore 3 masks, stacked one above the other, each mouth open in silent song. At the far end of the pavilion stood Seraphine Veyl. He wore no mask. That was the boldest vanity of all. He greeted the guests with open arms and a smile mild enough for a chapel fresco. "Graustark honors me," he said.
Burgermeister Pfaff bowed stiffly.
"We come under truce. Then truce shall be a jewel between us." Riker, watching from the darkness beyond the pavilion, with 20 soldiers hidden among the frost-stiff reeds, muttered, "Jewels cut too." Inside, the evening unfolded with sickening grace. Seraphine did not preach. He did not threaten. He let others do the work. A man in a priest's black robe, shaven-headed and hollow-eyed, spoke quietly with the Sigmarites. His name was Matthias Rill, once a lector from a town no map now named. He asked them whether faith without joy was anything but fear in ceremonial dress. One priest struck him. Matthias thanked him with tears in his eyes and offered the other cheek. A Tillian duelist named Lucien Voss entertained the guild champions by fencing 3 masked swordsmen at once. He moved like smoke, given cruelty. His blade tapped wrists, throats, groins, eyelids, never cutting more than a bead of blood. The Graustark swordsman watched with hungry shame. A sculptor unveiled statues beneath a purple cloth. The crowd fell silent. The figures were of Imperial nobles, merchants, priests, and soldiers, all rendered in white stone with impossible skill. Their faces were twisted not in pain, but in the exact private expression each viewer feared most in themselves: greed, lust for command, envy, cowardice, adoration of violence. Countess Elspeth stared at the statue nearest her, a woman with her own proud chin and devouring eyes, and forgot to breathe. "What stone is this?" whispered one painter. The sculptor smiled through his bronze mask. "Memory." Then the first blood was spilled. It began as entertainment. A Graustark champion named Henrik Bear, broad as a doorway and drunk on wounded pride, challenged Lucien Voss before the assembly. Henrik was the Butcher Guild's finest blade, a man who had won 7 city bouts and broken a road thief's spine with his bare hands. He wore a bull mask and carried a heavy saber nicked from honest use. Lucien bowed with his rapier low. "No death?" Henrik growled. Lucien's smile was apologetic. "No boredom." They fought in a cleared ring between tables. Henrik attacked like a slaughterhouse door kicked off its hinges. His saber came down hard enough to split skull and breastbone together. Lucien slid aside. The blade smashed a silver platter in half. Henrik reversed the cut, fast for such a big man, and caught the Tillian across the ribs. The crowd gasped. A red line opened in Lucien's white doublet. He looked down at it, touched the blood, and smiled as though tasting good wine. Then he moved. His rapier flickered into Henrik's forearm. The point punched through muscle and out the other side, quick as a needle. Henrik snarled and swung again. Lucian ducked, stepped inside, and opened the big man's cheek from mouth to ear. Teeth showed through the flap of flesh. Blood sheeted down Henrik's beard. The butcher champion roared and grabbed Lucian by the shoulder. For a heartbeat, strength beat elegance. Henrik lifted him and drove him through a table. Wood exploded, plates shattered. A roast swan tumbled onto the rugs. Henrik stomped after him, saber raised two-handed. Lucian rolled, came up on one knee, and thrust upward. The rapier entered beneath Henrik's jaw. It slid through tongue, palate, and skull with a soft cracking sound. The point burst from the top of the bull mask, carrying a dark bead of brain matter on its tip. Henrik stood there, eyes wide behind the mask, his saber still raised. Lucian twisted the blade. Henrik's legs folded. He collapsed face first into the ruined feast, twitching among gravy, glass, and his own spreading blood. There was silence. Then someone clapped. A young nobleman from Graustadt. Then a painter. Then Countess Elsbeth. Then half the pavilion. Applause rolled over the corpse like rain on a coffin. Riker heard it from the reeds and felt something in him go cold. The applause did not stop when Lucian placed one boot on Henrik's back and drew the rapier free with a wet scrape. It grew louder. People rose to their feet. A priest covered his mouth, not in horror, but to hide a smile. "Sigmar, preserve us," Sergeant Klug whispered. Riker drew his pistol. "He's trying." Inside the pavilion, Seraphine lifted his glass. "Grostadt has given us courage," he said. "Let us repay it with truth." The lantern flames turned silver. The music sharpened. At first, people thought the masks were changing. Then they understood their own faces were. The painted masks worn by the guests began to soften like wax held near a furnace. The swan, the fox, the sunburst, the stag, the saint, each folded inward, tightening against flesh, drinking sweat, pulling little cries from the throats beneath. Countess Elsbeth clawed at her silver swan mask. Her nails snapped. Blood ran down her wrists. The mask sank into her skin, becoming part of her face, silver feathers spreading across her cheekbones. A magistrate screamed as his golden judge's mask sealed his mouth shut. His eyes bulged. He made a high nasal squeal, while his tongue battered uselessly behind metal lips. One of the Sigmarite priests tore his mask free with both hands. His face came with it. Skin peeled from brow to chin in a wet red sheet, leaving muscle exposed and eyes rolling in a glistening skull. He staggered 3 steps, holding his own face in his hands like a dropped napkin, then fell into the arms of Matthias Rill, who kissed his bloody forehead and whispered comfort while the priest shrieked. That broke the truce. Riker and his men surged from the dark. The first Silver Host sentry turned at the sound of boots. Sergeant Kluge buried an axe in his neck so deep the blade struck spine. The man dropped without a cry, black blood pumping over his mirrored gorget. Riker fired both pistols into the next guard's chest. The shots punched him backward through a silk wall, leaving 2 smoking holes rimmed in burning cloth. "Graustadt men!" Riker roared. "Out! Out now!" The pavilion became a slaughterhouse. Imperial soldiers stormed in through the side, swords drawn, halberds stabbing. Masked cultists met them with curved blades and elegant malice. Steel rang. Lanterns swung. Tables overturned. A Graustad guard took a spear through the belly and folded around it, vomiting blood onto the shaft while the cultist twisted and lifted, spilling his intestines in a steaming rope over the rug. Klug smashed a silver-masked woman across the knee with her axe. Bone snapped sideways. The woman laughed and slashed upward, carving through Klugi's thigh. Klug fell on her, hooked thumbs under the mask, and drove her forehead into the floor again and again until the porcelain split and the skull beneath became red paste. Raker fought toward the council party. "Move!" he shouted. "Move! Damn you!" Some obeyed, most did not. A painter stood weeping before the memory statues, touching the stone lips of his own monstrous likeness. A merchant knelt among spilled coins, laughing as he stuffed them into his mouth. Countess Elsbeth watched the carnage with her silver swan face shining, utterly still, utterly enraptured. Burgomeister Pfaff stumbled toward Riker, mask half melted into his cheeks. "Help me!" Riker grabbed him by the collar. Pfaff's belly opened. Not by blade, by a hand. A huge masked warrior behind him had thrust spiked fingers through Pfaff's back and out through his gut. The Burgomeister looked down stupidly as the claws spread inside him, widening the wound. Sausage, wine, and blood poured out together. The warrior lifted him off the floor and shook him once. Pfaff came apart. His lower body hit the rugs first. The rest followed with a sound like wet laundry dropped from a roof. Riker put a pistol under the warrior's chin and fired. The back of the mask exploded. Bone chips pattered against the silk canopy. The body swayed and fell. "Elsbeth!" Riker barked. "On your feet!" The Countess turned toward him. "No," she said. Her voice was soft behind the silver feathers. "For the first time in my life, I am already standing." She drew a thin dagger from her sleeve and drove it into the throat of the nearest Graustad guardsman. The man stared at her in disbelief. Blood pulsed between her fingers. She leaned close as he drowned on it, watching every flutter, every desperate swallow. When he sagged, she let him drop and smiled at the red gloss on her hand. Riker raised his sword. Seraphine appeared between them. He had crossed the chaos without haste. No blood stained him. No blade touched him. Around him men butchered one another in the pink-silver light, but he moved as though through a ballroom. "Commandant," he said, almost warmly, "you came armed to a party." Riker swung for his head. Seraphine caught the blade in his bare hand. Steel bit into his palm. Blood welled, bright and red. His smile deepened. "Good," he whispered. "There is iron in you." Riker tried to wrench the sword free. It did not move. Seraphine stepped closer and pressed 2 fingers to Riker's brow. The Commandant's skull filled with music. Not heard, felt. It poured through his bones, turning his rage into color, his pain into appetite, his hatred into something vast and shining. For one terrible heartbeat, he wanted to kneel. He wanted to ask what shape he might become if he stopped resisting. Then Sergeant Klug hit Seraphine in the face with a chair. It shattered across his cheek. Riker stumbled back, gasping. Klug dragged him by the collar. "Move, you stubborn ox!" They ran. Behind them, the pavilion roared with laughter, screams, applause, and the wet percussion of bodies being opened. The retreat across the field was worse than the charge. Riker's men dragged whoever they could. A half-masked priest, 2 servants. one sobbing guildmaster with no hands. Crossbow bolts hissed from the pavilion. A soldier beside Riker took one through the back of the neck. The head snapped forward, the point jutting from his open mouth like a black tongue. Another fell clutching at his groin, blood spraying between his fingers in hot pulses. The north gate opened under covering fire from the walls. Cannons boomed. Iron balls tore through the pavilion hill. One smashed into a wagon and burst it apart, flinging limbs, silk, and splinters into the air. Another plowed through a rank of Silver Host infantry, reducing 3 men to spinning pieces of armor and meat. The city cheered. Then the pavilion curtains lifted. Not burned, not broken, lifted. The Silver Host stood within, arranged in perfect ranks around the surviving guests. Grostadt's own nobles stood among them. Countess Elsbeth wore her silver swan face and held a bloody dagger like a scepter. 2 guild champions knelt before Lucian Voss. Matthias Rill embraced a trembling Sigmarite priest whose flayed face was now hidden beneath a smiling mask of red lacquer. Painters, heirs, servants, officers, and magistrates stood beneath Seraphine's banners with tears on their cheeks and wonder in their eyes. Seraphine raised a glass toward the city walls. Graustadt applauded. Not all of it, not even most, but enough. From windows, balconies, and rooftops, hidden hands clapped in the darkness, soft at first, then louder, a secret thunder moving through the city. Riker stood inside the gate with blood in his beard and frost on his coat, listening as his own city answered the monster beyond the guns. By morning, the Silver Host was gone again. The pavilion vanished with them. The dead remained. So did the absences. 23 nobles, 11 guild officers, 6 priests, 14 artists, 31 trained guards, 7 artillerymen, 2 surgeons, 1 council clerk, with every map of Graustadt's defenses copied in his careful hand. In their place, the host left masks nailed to doors across the city. Silver, gold, red, white, each one smiling. Commandant Riker walked the north wall at dawn, while smoke rose from the field and crows picked at what the cannons had made of men. Sergeant Klug limped beside him, a wounded leg bound in strips of torn silk. "We held the walls," she said. Riker looked down at the city. Somewhere below, behind shutters and locked doors, people were still clapping, faintly, secretly, as if applauding a performance only they had been privileged to understand. "No," he said. They went through them. Chapter 3. The Hunt of the Painted Knight. Rain came down hard over the Bogan Road, turning ash, hoofprints, and old blood into a black paste that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. Captain Albrecht Kessler knelt in it without complaint. He was a broad, scarred man, with a face like a badly repaired wall, and eyes that had long ago lost the habit of kindness. A faded feather drooped from his hat. His breastplate was dented, his beard was full of rainwater, and the wolf pelt over his shoulders smelled of smoke, sweat, and wet dog. He had served on 3 northern campaigns, 2 border wars, and 1 winter siege where the defenders had eaten their own dead before the relief column arrived. He knew what chaos usually left behind. This was different. The farmstead ahead of him had not been burned. Its barn still stood. Chickens scratched in the yard. The old mother sat by the well, dead in her chair, with her throat cut so neatly the wound looked almost polite. Her 2 sons lay face down in the mud, hands tied behind them, skulls opened with hammer blows. Their brains had spilled white and grey into the rain. The daughter was gone. So was the family's best horse, 3 dresses, a silver mirror, and a painted wooden chest. Kessler picked up a torn scrap of silk from the mud. Silver thread glimmered in it. Behind him, Road Warden Ilse Krieger spat into the muck, same as the others. "Aye," Kessler said. "No looting except what they fancy. No fires, no rape left behind, no butchered livestock. Just the stubborn dead and the pretty taken." "Not taken," said witch hunter Hedda Laukert. Kessler looked back. Hedda sat on a black mare under the skeletal branches of an apple tree, hat brim dripping steadily. She was lean, pale, and dressed in a long leather coat stitched with strips of parchment. Little iron charms dangled from her belt. One hand rested on the stock of a pistol. The other held a small diary taken from the dead girl's room. She packed, Hedda said. "Carefully. Spare stockings, a comb, her mother's pearls." She wrote 3 pages on the beauty of the Silver Riders and the dullness of her life here. She shut the diary. She left willingly. Krieger swore. Her brothers tried to stop her. Kessler stood, knees cracking. He looked at the dead sons. One had lost half his face to the hammer. Teeth lay scattered in the mud like spilled dice. The other's fingers were broken backward, every one of them, as if he had clawed at a door until someone grew tired of listening. "They were in her way," Kessler said. The men behind him muttered prayers. There were 28 of them left in the hunt. State soldiers, road wardens, 2 handgunners from Graustadt, a barber surgeon, 3 grim militia volunteers, and Hedda with her mute flagellant, Oscar, who had branded prayers into his own chest and spoke only by pointing at things that needed killing. They had been tracking the Silver Host for 6 days through vineyard country and rain-choked woods. 6 days of finding empty manor houses, abandoned chapels, dueling yards with fresh blood in the sand, and coaching inns where the cellars were full of corpses but the best wine was gone. At every stop, the same story. The host had not simply abducted, it had invited. Kessler hated that most of all. Honest fear was clean. A man could understand fear. Fear made folk bolt doors, raise spears, cling to gods and children. But desire? Desire opened gates in the dark and smiled while doing it. He wiped rain from his eyes and turned south. "They're slowing." Krieger frowned. "How do you know?" "They want us close." The road warden glanced at the trees. The woods seemed suddenly crowded with shadows. Hedda smiled thinly. "Then we oblige them." By dusk, they reached the old Falkenride tourney field. It had been built in better years by some mad baron with Bretonnian tastes and Imperial money. The lists lay in a shallow bowl between wooded hills, ringed by rotting stands and moss-stained statues of forgotten knights. Painted shields hung from poles, faded by decades of weather. The tilting rail still stood, though warped and black with rot. At the southern edge rose the ruin of a viewing lodge, its roof collapsed, its stone arches crawling with ivy. Lanterns burned there, not campfires. Lanterns, dozens of them, rose and silver, hanging from poles around the field. Kessler halted at the tree line and lifted a fist. His men sank low among wet ferns and bracken. Beyond the trees, music drifted across the tourney ground, light and merry, utterly wrong, under the bruised evening sky. The silver host waited in the lists. Not all of it. Perhaps 50 warriors. Enough. They had arranged themselves like spectators at a festival. Masked soldiers lounged in the stands. Cavalry waited at the far end, pale horses stamping in the mud. New recruits from the Empire stood among them, in borrowed finery and stolen armor. Noble sons, merchant heirs, officers who had once worn state colors, artists in paint-spattered cloaks, priests with their hammer pendants filed smooth. At the center of the field stood Lucien Voss, the painted knight. He wore armor, lacquered in red, gold, and black, each plate marked with scenes of duels, embraces, feasts, and executions so finely painted they seemed to move by lantern light. His helm hung from one hand, in the other he held his long Tylian rapier. His handsome face bore the faint scars of old vanity and newer cruelty. He smiled toward the woods, as if greeting friends late to dinner. "Kessler!" he called. The captain's men stiffened. Kessler said nothing. Lucian laughed. "Come now. You have followed us through rain, dung, and provincial misery. Do not become shy at the threshold." Hedda leaned close. "Trap," Kessler snorted. "Everything's a trap. Question is whether it's worth stepping in." Lucian lifted his blade, pointing toward the ruined stands. A figure was dragged into the lantern light. A boy, no more than 16, wearing the blue and white of a Grostat messenger. His face was swollen. One ear was gone. Blood striped his chin. Krieger hissed, "That's Emmerich. He rode with Riker's dispatches." Lucian put the rapier tip beneath the boy's chin. "I was told Imperial soldiers value courage," he said. "I have prepared a little stage on which you may demonstrate it." Kessler stepped out of the trees. Hedda cursed under her breath, but followed. The rest came after, spreading into a ragged line at the edge of the field. Rain ticked against helmets and dripped from spear points. Lucian bowed extravagantly. "Captain Albrecht Kessler, Mud's own champion. Let the boy go. In a moment." "Now," Lucian sighed. "You Empire men, always trying to skip to the ugly part." He flicked his wrist. The rapier opened Emmerich's throat. The cut was so clean the boy looked merely surprised. Then the wound yawned. Blood poured down his chest in a sudden hot sheet. He clutched at it, fingers slipping in red, and made a wet gulping sound before collapsing to his knees. Lucian stepped aside neatly to avoid the spray. Krieger raised her crossbow. Kessler caught it and shoved it down. No, her eyes burned. "He butchered him. Aye, and wants us charging angry." The boy pitched forward into the mud. Lucian's smile thinned. "Practical. Disappointing, but practical." Then the stands erupted. Crossbows snapped from the shadows. Bolts hissed through the rain. A handgunner beside Kessler jerked backward as a bolt punched through his cheek and out the back of his neck. He fell gurgling, tongue flapping through the torn side of his face. Another man took a shaft in the thigh and screamed as the barbed head buried deep, pinning muscle to bone. "Shields!" Kessler roared. "Advance left! Left!" The hunt became a fight. Imperial men surged into the tourney field, boots sliding in mud, shields raised under the black rain, bolts hammered wood. One punched through a shield and nailed the bearer's forearm to it. He shrieked until Hedda stepped behind him, snapped the shaft, and shoved him onward. The silver host descended from the stands with elegant discipline. They came in silver masks and polished mail, curved swords drawn, moving through rain as if in a ballroom. Kessler met the first with an axe blow that split mask, nose, teeth, and jaw in one brutal line. The cultist dropped, face opening around the blade like chopped fruit. Kessler ripped the axe free, caught a thrust on his breastplate, and drove his knee into the attacker's groin hard enough to lift him. As the man folded, Kessler buried the axe in the back of his skull. Bone cracked. Blood sprayed warm across Kessler's hands. To his right, Oscar the Flagellant waded into 3 masked swordsmen with a 2-handed flail. The iron head smashed one man's shoulder into powder, caving the armor inward until broken bone jutted through the mail. A second blade opened Oscar's scalp from brow to crown. He did not make a sound. He swung again and caught the swordsman in the mouth. Teeth, lips, and jaw exploded outward in a red fan. Hedda fired both pistols into a charging cultist's chest, then drew a short sword and cut down a priest who came at her shrieking hymns backwards. The priest's black robe was embroidered with silver thread. His face was wet with tears of joy. Hedda opened his belly from hip to hip. He fell laughing, trying to scoop his intestines back into himself as if embarrassed to have dropped them. The Imperial line pushed forward. Then the cavalry hit. Pale horses thundered from the far end of the lists, riders low behind lances wrapped in ribbons. The impact tore through Kessler's left flank. A road warden vanished beneath hooves, his scream crushed into a wet cough as the beasts trampled him flat. A militia volunteer took a lance through the chest and was carried 10 yards before sliding off the shaft, leaving ribs and lung meat clinging to the wood. Kessler grabbed a fallen spear. The nearest rider bore down on him, mask shaped like a smiling angel. Kessler waited until the last heartbeat, then dropped to one knee and braced the spear butt in the mud. The horse impaled itself. Its chest struck the point with a sound like an axe entering a butcher's block. The spear punched deep. The beast screamed, a high, almost human noise, and collapsed forward. Its rider flew over its neck. Kessler rose to meet him and swung the axe into his landing body. The blade bit through the rider's hip. The man hit the mud in 2 pieces, legs twitching separately from the torso. He tried to crawl, silver mask staring blindly upward, until Kessler stamped on his throat and felt the windpipe collapse under his heel. "Form on me!" Kessler bellowed. "Form, damn your eyes!" They formed, barely. 12 men around him, then 10, then 9. The tourney field dissolved into lantern smoke, rain, blood, and screaming steel. The old painted shields on the poles shuddered as bodies crashed against them. The mud became red soup. Men slipped, rose, killed, and died on their knees. Through it all, Lucien Voss watched from the center of the lists, waiting. Kessler hacked his way toward him. A cultist with twin knives opened Kessler's sleeve and laid his forearm bare to the bone. Kessler headbutted him, crushing his nose flat beneath the mask, then hooked fingers into the eye holes and tore the mask forward. Skin came with it. The cultist screamed, face flayed around the eyes, and Kessler drove a dagger under his chin. Another came at him with a halberd. Kessler caught the shaft under his arm, took the blade across his shoulder, and felt mail split, flesh part, hot pain bloom. He slammed his axe into the man's knee. The joint burst sideways. Before the cultist could fall, Kessler chopped into his exposed neck. The head did not come off cleanly. It hung by meat and gristle, bobbing against the breastplate, while blood pumped down the armor. At last, the space opened. Lucian stood before him, rapier lowered. The fighting seemed to draw back of its own accord, leaving a circle of churned mud between them. Rain ran down Lucian's painted armor, making the little seams gleam. Kessler's breath rasped in his chest. His left eye was swelling shut. His axe hung heavy in his hand. Lucian tilted his head. "You look dreadful. You talk too much." "Yes, but beautifully." Lucian struck. The rapier came fast enough to vanish. Kessler twisted. The point punched through his coat and scored along his ribs. He swung the axe. Lucian drifted away, graceful as smoke, and cut Kessler across the cheek. Blood filled the captain's beard. Again, a thrust to the thigh, a flick to the wrist. A line opened across Kessler's brow. Lucian painted him red by inches. The silver host cheered. Kessler advanced anyway. Lucian frowned. The rapier drove for Kessler's throat. Kessler took it through the meat of his left hand. Pain flashed white. Steel slid between bones and burst from his palm. Kessler clamped down. Lucian tried to pull free. Kessler smiled with bloody teeth. "Got you!" He yanked. Lucian stumbled forward. Kessler's axe came up. Not elegant, not quick, but full of every mile of mud and every dead farm boy and every ruined town behind him. It hit Lucian in the side. Painted armor split. Ribs cracked. The axe sank deep into the duelist's body, biting through lacquer, muscle, and lung. Lucian screamed then, a raw, offended sound. Kessler wrenched the blade free and swung again. Lucian dropped backward, barely avoiding death. The axe carved through his breastplate and tore a red trench across his chest. He fell to one knee in the mud, one hand pressed to his side, blood leaking between his fingers. Kessler raised the axe for the killing blow. A horn sounded. Not from the field, from the woods behind them. Kessler turned. Lanterns moved in the trees. Dozens. Then hundreds. The rest of the silver host was not retreating south. It had already passed them. Through the woods, along hidden tracks, by river barges and noble coaches and pilgrims' roads, the tourney field had been a stage, and Kessler's hunt had been the audience. Hedda saw it too. Her face hardened. "Captain!" Kessler looked back at Lucian. The painted knight laughed, through blood bubbling at his lips. "You win," Lucian whispered. "That is the sweetest part." Kessler brought the axe down. Lucian rolled with impossible speed. The blade buried in mud. A smoke bomb burst at Kessler's feet, filling the air with silver powder that burned his eyes and throat. He swung blind, coughing, hearing laughter, hooves, screams. When the smoke thinned, Lucian was gone. So were the remaining cultists, who could still run. The tourney field belonged to the dead. Kessler stood among them, swaying. Rain washed blood down his face and into his mouth. Around him, wounded men groaned. Oscar knelt beside a dying road warden and held the man's hand while he bled out through the stump where his leg had been. Hedda moved from body to body with a pistol, granting mercy where there was no hope and fire where there was corruption. Krieger came limping from the ruined stands carrying a leather satchel. Her face was grey. "You need to see this." Inside were letters, seals, names. Graustadt, Hohenbruck, Ubersdorf, Helmgart way stations, Vine estates, temples, sword schools, noble courts, officers already placed, recruits already dispatched. Safe houses marked in neat silver ink. Kessler read until the words blurred. Half the cult's strength had not been on the field at all. It had gone ahead wearing imperial rings, priestly robes, officers' sashes, and courtly smiles. Hedda looked south, where the lanterns had vanished into the rain. "We hurt them." Kessler spat blood into the mud. "No, we amused them." At the far end of the field, nailed to the old tilting rail, hung the dead messenger boy. Someone had placed a silver mask over his face. Kessler tore it free and crushed it under his boot until it bent out of shape. Then he lifted his axe and started walking south. Chapter 4. The Silver Court. The winter gala at Schloss Vogelmark glittered like a jewel set into a corpse. Snow lay thick across the valley, softening the bones of the world beneath a white burial cloth. The castle rose above it on a black crag, all steep roofs, gargoyles, torch-lit windows, and old imperial stones slick with ice. Below, the river moved sluggishly between frozen banks. Above, the sky sagged low and starless, heavy with more snow. Inside, the empire danced. There were chandeliers of cut glass, mirrors from Tylea, carpets from Araby, tapestries showing dead counts killing dead beasts, tables stacked with sugared fruit, roasted boar, spiced wine, trout and jelly, goose liver, and little pastries shaped like twin-tailed comets. Musicians played from a balcony wreathed in evergreen. Noble women rustled in silk. Officers laughed too loudly. Priests drank too carefully. Courtiers bowed, smiled, and sharpened one another with words. Every guest wore a mask. It was tradition, they said. A harmless winter masquerade. A custom older than the current count's grandfather. A night when ranks softened, scandal breathed, and the great families of the province pretended they did not spend the rest of the year feeding on one another. Captain Albrecht Kessler stood in the snow outside the castle walls and watched the light bleed through the high windows. He hated masks. His wounds had been sewn badly and quickly. A red scar dragged down his cheek. His left hand was wrapped around the place where Lucien Voss's rapier had gone through it. His shoulder burned every time he moved. Under his battered cloak, his breastplate had been scrubbed clean, but old blood lived in the dents. Beside him, witch hunter Hedda Laukert checked the wheel lock on her pistol. "Count's men will not open the gate," she said. "No," Kessler replied. "Half the guest list appears in the letters from Falkenried. Aye, the other half may be innocent." Kessler looked at the castle. Music floated faintly through the storm. "Poor bastards." Road Warden Ilse Krieger spat into the snow. Sergeant Marta Kluge tightened the straps on her leg brace. Oscar the Flagellant stood shirtless despite the cold, prayers branded across his chest, flail hanging in one hand like a promise. They had 32 fighters left. Mud-stained soldiers, road wardens, 2 surviving Grostadt handgunners, 4 castle servants who had fled at dusk, and a priest of Moor who had seen the guest list and quietly fetched his burial knife. Not an army, a nail in the dark. Kessler turned to the slope below the west wall. The old sewage culvert breathed steam into the snow. "Through there," he said. Klug grimaced. "Of course through there." They crawled into the castle through filth, freezing water, and rat bones. The culvert was narrow enough to scrape shoulders, and low enough to force them onto hands and knees. Black water ran beneath them. Something dead and soft burst under Kessler's palm. The stink was thick enough to chew. Behind him, A young road warden retched until Hedda clamped a hand over his mouth and whispered that if he made another sound, she would cut his throat before the enemy had the pleasure. By the time they reached the iron grate beneath the kitchens, Kessler was soaked to the waist and in a worse mood than usual. Oscar wrapped both hands around the bars, muscles bunched beneath his scarred skin. Veins rose in his neck. The grate groaned, bent, then tore loose from the mortar with a shriek of metal that vanished beneath the roar of kitchen noise above. They came up among heat, steam, blood, and meat. The kitchens were chaos. Servants rushed between ovens. Cooks shouted. A gutted stag hung from hooks, its empty body cavity stuffed with herbs. 3 masked men in castle livery stood near the wine casks, quietly pouring silver powder into decanters. Kessler stepped behind the nearest and drove his dagger into the man's kidney. The cultist arched, mouth opening. Kessler clamped a hand over it and shoved the blade higher, twisting until the body shuddered and went slack. Krieger shot the second through the eye with a small crossbow. He dropped into a basket of onions, heels drumming. The third drew breath to scream. Hedda's pistol went off. The shot took him under the jaw. His head snapped back and burst against the wall in a wet fan of skull fragments, tongue, teeth, and blood. A scullery maid stared at the mess, covered in red freckles. Kessler pointed at the wine. "Pour it out." The maid blinked, then seized a decanter and smashed it on the floor. Within moments, servants were overturning casks, dumping poisoned wine into drains, muttering prayers as silver froth hissed against the stones. Above them, the music changed. It grew sweeter, crueler. Kessler looked up. "We're late." The ballroom doors were 40 feet tall and carved with hunting scenes, nobles on horseback, stags at bay, hounds with open jaws. 2 guards stood before them in feathered helms and polished breastplates. Kessler did not slow. The first guard raised a halberd. Klug's axe took him in the knee, splitting the joint through greave and bone. He fell, screaming. Oscar's flail came down on his helmet and crushed it flat, driving metal into skull with a sound like a hammer through a pumpkin. The second guard turned to run. Krieger tackled him from behind, hooked her knife under his chin, and sawed through his throat until blood pumped down the front of his polished armor. Kessler kicked the ballroom doors open. The silver court turned to look. For a heartbeat, the scene was too beautiful to be real. Hundreds of masked guests stood beneath chandeliers blazing with candlelight. Snow tapped softly at the tall windows. Silver ribbons hung from the rafters. The musicians played with smiles fixed too wide. At the center of the ballroom, a circle had been cleared around a marble fountain filled not with water, but with dark red wine, or blood. Seraphine Veyl stood on the fountain's rim in white and silver, radiant as a saint from a blasphemous chapel. Beside him were Countess Elsbeth, with her silver swan face, Matthias Rill in priestly black, and Lucien Voss, pale but alive, his wounded side bound in silk beneath his painted armor. Around them stood officers of the empire, nobles, priests, duelists, captains, magistrates, artists. Half the province's spine rotted from within. Seraphine smiled when he saw Kessler. "Captain, mud at the threshold of splendor. How faithful of you." Kessler raised his pistol and shot the nearest musician in the chest. The man flew backward over his chair, violin squealing as it broke beneath him. For one shocked breath, no one moved. Then Kessler roared, "Empire, steel!" His fighters surged into the ballroom. The gala became a massacre. A nobleman in a golden fox mask drew a rapier and lunged at Kessler. Kessler caught the thrust on his breastplate, stepped in, and smashed the pistol butt across the man's mouth. Teeth snapped. The fox mask cracked. Kessler drove his sword up beneath the ribs and felt the blade grind through cartilage into the heart. He wrenched it free and kicked the dying noble into a table of pastries. Klug buried her axe in a magistrate's chest, ripped it out, and took a saber cut across the face that opened her cheek to the molars. She spat blood and hit the attacker in the throat, with the axe haft hard enough to break his neck backward. Hedda moved like a black knife through silk. She shot a priestess wearing a dove mask through the stomach, then stepped close and fired again into her forehead when the woman began chanting with her guts in her hands. The second shot painted a mirror behind her with brains. Guests screamed, some fled, some drew hidden blades, some laughed and joined the killing. A courtier leapt onto the back of one of Kessler's soldiers and bit out his ear before stabbing him repeatedly in the side with a jeweled hairpin. The soldier spun, shrieking, until Oscar's flail smashed both of them into the floor in a tangle of broken limbs. The chandeliers swayed. Blood spread across polished marble. At the fountain, Seraphine lifted both hands. "Behold!" he cried, voice ringing over the carnage. "The Empire as it truly is. Not pious, not noble, hungry, beautifully hungry." The blood in the fountain rose. It lifted in strands, twisting upward like crimson ribbons. The masked guests began to sing. Not all of them, enough. Their voices joined the music, and the air thickened with heat. Mirrors along the walls clouded over, then cleared to show impossible reflections. Cities burning beneath violet skies, nobles kneeling before silver thrones, priests kissing blades, armies opening their own gates. Kessler saw himself in one mirror, not as he was, as he might be, a general in black armor, cities bowing, enemies broken, no councils, no fools, no soft-handed lords, sending hard men to die and then calling it necessary. For a moment, he wanted it so badly his teeth hurt. Then Krieger screamed. Lucian Voss had found her! The painted knight moved with wounded elegance, one hand pressed to his side, rapier flashing in the other. Krieger fought with axe and knife, quick and vicious, but Lucian was a wasp made human. He opened her forearm, her shoulder, her thigh, each cut precise, humiliating. Kessler turned toward them. Countess Elsbeth stepped into his path. Her silver swan mask had grown into her flesh. Feathers of metal curled along her jaw. Her eyes glittered behind the beak. She held two thin daggers, both already wet. "You should have burned me at Graustadt," she said. She came at him laughing. Elsbeth was fast, faster than any court-bred parasite had a right to be. One dagger slid under Kessler's guard and punched through his coat into the meat above his hip. The other flicked toward his eye. He jerked aside and felt the blade cut his brow. He slammed a fist into her stomach. She folded, but not enough. Her knee came up between his legs. Pain burst through him. She slashed his forearm, opened 3 bright lines, then leaned in and whispered, "I finally became myself." Kessler headbutted her, The silver beak split his forehead. His skull rang. Her mask cracked. He did it again. This time something beneath the mask broke. She staggered. He grabbed her wrist, twisted until the bone snapped, and drove her own dagger up beneath her chin. The blade went through the roof of her mouth. Elsbeth shuddered against him, eyes wide with wounded amazement. Kessler shoved harder until the point pierced the top of her skull under the silver feathers. Her body went loose. He let her fall. Across the room, Krieger lost her axe. Lucien's rapier pierced her lung. She gasped, eyes bulging, blood bubbling at her lips. Lucien stepped close, almost tender, and whispered something in her ear. Krieger responded by pulling a hidden pistol from her belt and firing into his belly. The shot folded him. Lucien staggered back, both hands pressed to the black hole in his armor. Krieger dropped to one knee, drowning, and smiled red. Kessler reached them as Lucien tried to rise. The painted knight looked up, furious and terrified. "No," he rasped. "Not like this." Kessler's axe took him at the base of the neck. The first blow lodged halfway. Lucien shrieked, hands clawing at the haft. Kessler put a boot against his chest and ripped it free in a spray of arterial red. The second blow finished it. Lucien's head rolled across the marble, painted helm still attached, mouth opening and closing as if searching for one final clever remark. Krieger lay on her back, staring at the chandelier. Kessler knelt beside her. She shoved a blood-slick packet into his hand. "Names," she choked. "More of them." Then she died with her eyes open. Kessler rose. At the fountain, Seraphine had begun to change. His beauty stretched too thin, like silk over knives. His limbs lengthened. His fingers became talons. His smile split wider than any human mouth should allow, revealing needle teeth wet with silver light. Horns curled back from his pale hair. His shadow rose behind him in the shape of something vast, graceful, and obscene. The remaining cultists fell to their knees. Matthias Rill wept. Perfect. Hedda shot him in the face. The fallen priest's head snapped backward, mask and skull opening like a dropped egg. He collapsed into the blood fountain, limbs twitching. Seraphine looked down at the corpse with mild disappointment. Then he leapt. He crossed the ballroom in a blur of white and silver. Oscar met him with the flail. Seraphine caught the chains in one clawed hand, pulled, and tore the weapon away. His other hand opened Oscar from collarbone to groin. The flagellant's chest peeled apart. Ribs sprang outward. Lungs pulsed in the candlelight. Oscar looked down at himself with solemn interest, then wrapped both arms around Seraphine and held him. Hedda screamed a prayer and fired into the champion's back. Kessler charged. Seraphine tore free of Oscar's embrace, ripping the dying man in half as he turned. Blood and organs splashed across the marble. Kessler swung his axe for Seraphine's head. The champion ducked, claws raking across Kessler's breastplate, carving furrows through steel. The impact hurled him against the fountain. Pain flashed through his ribs. Seraphine bent over him. "You could be glorious," he whispered. "You already understand the truth. The Empire is mud pretending to be marble. Join me, and we will strip away the lie." Kessler spat blood into his face. Seraphine sighed. Hedda struck from behind with a silvered burial knife taken from the priest of Mor. She drove it into Seraphine's shoulder, The champion screamed, not in pain alone, but outrage. He backhanded her across the room. She hit a pillar with a crack and fell hard, broken but breathing. Kessler grabbed one of the poisoned wine decanters from the shattered table beside him. Silver powder still clung inside the glass. He smashed it against the fountain rim, drove the jagged neck into Seraphine's wounded shoulder, and twisted. The powder hissed as it entered the cut. Seraphine howled. The mirrors exploded. Glass burst inward from every wall, shredding cultists and guests alike. A noble woman's face vanished under a storm of shards. A captain's throat opened in 4 places at once. The blood fountain collapsed, its rising ribbons falling as ordinary gore across the marble. The ritual broke. Outside, the castle bells began to ring, not by hands, by alarm, by panic, by servants, by soldiers finally understanding that the monster was inside the house. Seraphine reeled backward, smoke rising from his wound. For the first time, his perfect calm cracked. Beneath it was hatred, ancient, spoiled, bottomless hatred. "This is not victory," he snarled. Kessler staggered upright, axe in both hands. "Best I could manage." He swung. Seraphine caught the axe, but weakly. The blade bit into his palm. Kessler shoved forward, roaring, every wound tearing open, every muscle burning. The axe slid through Seraphine's hand and cut into his chest. Not deep enough. Never deep enough. The champion shrieked and dissolved into silver smoke. A blast of perfume, blood, and freezing wind hurled Kessler backward. When he hit the floor, the world went white at the edges. Through blurred eyes, he saw the remaining silver host flee through broken windows, servants' passages, hidden doors. Some were cut down by castle guards pouring into the ballroom. Some vanished into snow. Some tore off masks and begged innocence, until Hedda, crawling with one useless arm, shot them where they knelt. By dawn, Schloss Vogelmark was a charnel house. Bodies lay in heaps beneath the chandeliers. The marble floor was black-red from wall to wall. The fountain was clogged with limbs, masks, and torn silk. Servants moved through the ruin with buckets and shaking hands. Priests muttered rites until their voices failed. Kessler stood on the balcony, overlooking the valley, wrapped in bandages, one hand clenched around Krieger's blood-stained packet of names. Hedda came beside him, her arm bound tight to her chest. "He escaped," she said. We exposed them. Will it be enough?" Below, hoofprints marked the snow where riders had fled south in the dark. Kessler watched them until the falling snow began to cover the tracks. "No," he said. Behind them, in the ruined ballroom, a surviving noble began to laugh. Not loudly, not madly, softly, as if remembering beautiful music.